A memo was sent to the executive offices of the White Star Line in the spring of 1910. It did not mention icebergs. It did not mention the North Atlantic. It did not mention lifeboats. Not directly. The subject line read, in the clipped language of Edwardian corporate correspondence, Passenger Deck Aesthetics and Allocation Efficiency. 14 pages. Charts, diagrams, a detailed analysis of how much first-class promenade space would be lost if the ship carried the number of lifeboats recommended by the company's own naval architects. The answer was 11%. 11% of the sun deck gone. 11% of the area where first-class passengers would take their morning constitutional, drink their bouillon, and admire the horizon. The memo included a counter-proposal. Reduce the lifeboats from 48 to 16. Supplement with 4 collapsible Engelhart boats stowed under the davits. Total capacity, roughly 1,100 people. The ship would carry 2,200. Someone initialed the memo. Someone filed it. The ship was built to the revised specification. 2 years later, on the night of April 14, 1912, 1,500 people discovered what 11% of deck space was worth. Blackwell has spent considerable time with documents like this one, not because they are rare, but because they are common. Filing cabinets and server farms across a dozen countries hold thousands of memos with the same essential structure. A problem is identified. A solution is proposed. The solution costs money. An alternative is chosen. The alternative costs lives, but it costs them later, and the budget is due now. This is how disasters are manufactured, not through incompetence, not through ignorance, through arithmetic. The Titanic is where most people begin this story, but Blackwell does not begin there because the Titanic was special. He begins there because the Titanic was ordinary. The decisions that produced it followed a pattern so predictable, so mechanical, that once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it in everything that came after. The pattern has 5 stages. They have not changed in more than a century. Stage 1. An engineer identifies a risk. The engineer is qualified. The data is clear. The recommendation is specific and actionable. Stage 2. The recommendation reaches someone whose primary metric is not safety but cost. This is not a villain. This is a job description. Their role is to allocate resources. Safety is one line item among dozens. Stage 3. The cost of the recommendation is compared to the probability of the event. If the event is unlikely, the cost is deemed unjustifiable. The word used most often is disproportionate. Stage 4. A compromise is reached. Partial measures, monitoring, deferred maintenance. The language shifts from engineering to management. Load-bearing becomes risk acceptable. Failure threshold becomes tolerance envelope. The report is filed. Stage 5. The event occurs. Commissions are formed. The filed report is discovered. Headlines use the word preventable. Regulations are updated. The updated regulations are eventually deemed disproportionate by someone whose primary metric is cost. The cycle restarts. Alexander Carlisle understood this pattern before anyone gave it a name. He was the chief designer at Harland & Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that built the Titanic. In 1910, Carlisle presented plans to the White Star Line showing the Titanic equipped with 48 lifeboats. The davits he designed, the well-in double-acting davits, could handle them. The hardware was ready. The capacity was there. The White Star Line's managing director, Joseph Bruce Ismay, was in the room. So was Harold Sanderson, the company's general manager. Carlisle showed the plans. He explained the numbers. He noted that the Board of Trade regulations, written in 1894, only required boats for a fraction of the passengers, but that the regulations were outdated and the ship should exceed them. The conversation, according to Carlyle's later testimony before the British inquiry, lasted approximately 5 to 10 minutes. The plans were noted. The lifeboat count was reduced. Carlyle did not argue. He later said he wished he had argued more forcibly. He retired from Harland and Wolff the following year before the ship was completed. He was 60 years old. He attended the inquiry. He gave his testimony. He was not recalled. The Board of Trade regulations that governed the Titanic's lifeboat requirements were written for ships of 10,000 gross tons. The Titanic displaced over 46,000. The regulations had not been updated. The advisory committee that was supposed to review them had not met since 1894. When asked why, Board of Trade officials testified that the committee's recommendations were non-binding and that the existing rules were considered adequate. Adequate, a word that appears in disaster testimony with the regularity of a metronome. The mathematics were not ambiguous. A ship carrying 2,200 people had lifeboat space for roughly half. On a calm night in the North Atlantic, with the nearest rescue ship 4 hours away, mathematics became mortality. The boats that were launched left with empty seats. Boat number 1 carried 12 people. Its capacity was 40. The crew had not drilled for a full evacuation. There had been no boat drill scheduled for April 14th. It had been cancelled. 1,517 people entered the water that night. The water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, unconsciousness arrives in approximately 15 minutes. The nearest ship, the Carpathia, arrived in 1 hour and 20 minutes. The British inquiry lasted 36 days. The American inquiry ran concurrently. Both concluded that the ship did not carry enough lifeboats. Both recommended changes to maritime law. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea was convened in 1914. It required lifeboats for every person on board. It took 1,500 lives and 2 government inquiries to move from 11% of deck space to 100% of passengers. Blackwell notes the date, 1914. The same year Europe began a war that would demonstrate, on a continental scale, the same pattern. Warnings issued, warnings filed, warnings ignored, consequences measured in bodies. But this is not a story about war. This is a story about paper, about the distance between a filed report and an implemented recommendation, about the specific, measurable, documentable gap between knowing and doing. That gap has a name in engineering. It is called the implementation deficit. In corporate governance, it is called residual risk acceptance. In plain language, it is called hoping it does not happen on your watch. Blackwell has another file. This one is thicker. It concerns a stretch of coastline on the northeastern shore of Japan and a power station called Fukushima Daiichi. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant was commissioned in 1971. It was built by General Electric, operated by the Tokyo Electric Power Company, known as TEPCO, and situated on the coast of Fukushima Prefecture. The plant's 6 boiling water reactors generated enough electricity to power roughly 4.5 million homes. It was one of the 15 largest nuclear power stations in the world. The plant was built behind a seawall. The seawall was designed to withstand a tsunami of 3.5 meters. This number was based on historical records available at the time of construction, primarily the 1960 Chilean tsunami, which had sent waves of approximately 3 meters to the Fukushima coast. 3.5 meters, a number chosen in 1967 based on data from 1960, protecting a plant that would operate for decades into the future. The number was adequate. That word again. In 2000, TEPCO conducted an internal study. The study modeled the potential impact of a tsunami generated by a fault system closer to the plant than the Chilean source. The model produced a wave height of 15.7 meters, more than 4 times the height of the existing sea wall. TEPCO reviewed the study. They did not raise the sea wall. They did not retrofit the backup generators which sat in basements below the waterline. They classified the study as a hypothetical exercise and filed it. In 2008, the same modeling was repeated with updated seismic data. The result was similar. Waves between 8 and 15 meters were plausible for the region. TEPCO engineers presented the findings internally. The recommendation was to reassess the seawall height and relocate critical backup systems to higher ground. The estimated cost of the seawall upgrade was approximately 150 billion yen. At the time, roughly $1.5 billion. TEPCO's annual revenue was over 5 trillion yen. The upgrade would have represented less than 3% of 1 year's revenue. The recommendation was deferred. The word used was study. TEPCO committed to further study of the issue. The backup generators remained in the basements. The seawall remained at its original height. In 2009, a government nuclear safety panel reviewed tsunami risk for coastal plants. A researcher named Yukinobu Okamura, head of the Active Fault and Earthquake Research Center, presented evidence that a massive earthquake and tsunami had struck the same coastline in the year 869. The Jogan earthquake. Historical records described waves penetrating several kilometers inland. Okamura's presentation was direct. He recommended that TEPCO incorporate the Jogan event into their safety baseline. The minutes of the meeting record TEPCO's response. They said the historical evidence was uncertain and that further research was needed. Further research, further study, the vocabulary of deferral. Blackwell has encountered these phrases in documents spanning 3 centuries. They mean the same thing every time. Not now, not yet, not on this budget cycle. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 in the afternoon local time, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the Pacific coast of Tohoku. It was the most powerful earthquake ever recorded in Japan. The earthquake triggered a tsunami. The waves that reached Fukushima Daiichi were approximately 14 meters high, 4 times the sea wall. The water overtopped the barrier. It flooded the basements. It destroyed the backup diesel generators. Without backup power, the cooling systems for 3 of the 6 reactors failed. The reactor cores began to overheat. Pressure built. Hydrogen accumulated. Over the following 3 days, 3 reactor buildings experienced hydrogen explosions. The cores of reactors 1, 2, and 3 suffered meltdowns. Radioactive material was released into the atmosphere and the Pacific Ocean. 154,000 people were evacuated from the surrounding area. Many have never returned. The direct cost of the disaster has been estimated at between $200 billion and $600 billion, depending on the scope of measurement. The cleanup is expected to take between 30 and 40 years. As of the latest assessment, it is not complete. $1.5 billion for the seawall, between $200 billion and $600 billion for the consequences. TEPCO's internal study in 2000 had produced the correct number. 15.7 meters. The actual tsunami was 14. The engineers were right. The accountants overruled them. The difference between the 2 numbers was measured in displaced families, contaminated soil, and a cleanup timeline measured in decades. Okamura, the researcher who cited the Jogan earthquake, published his assessment in 2009. He was not obscure. He was the head of an active research center within the Japanese government. His warning was specific, cited historical precedent, named the exact coastline, and recommended a specific action. It was noted. It was filed. It was not implemented. Blackwell does not highlight this for emotional effect. He highlights it because the structure is identical to Alexander Carlisle's lifeboat presentation in 1910. An expert, qualified and specific, presents data. The data is acknowledged. The recommendation is deferred. The event occurs. A commission investigates. The deferred recommendation is cited as the proximate cause. 101 years apart. Different continent. Different technology. Different scale. Same 5 stages. Same vocabulary. Adequate. Hypothetical. Further study. This is the point where the pattern stops being historical and becomes something else entirely. Blackwell has a third set of documents. These are not from 1910 or 2008. They are current. They describe the present condition of infrastructure in the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, and 14 other industrialized nations. In 2021, the American Society of Civil Engineers published its quadrennial infrastructure report card. The overall grade was C-. This was considered an improvement. The previous grade, in 2017, was D+. The report assessed 16 categories of infrastructure. Bridges received a grade of C. This grade meant, in the report's own language, mediocre, requires attention. The specifics beneath the grade were less neutral. Of the 617,000 bridges in the United States, approximately 42,000 were classified as structurally deficient. Structurally deficient does not mean the bridge will collapse tomorrow. It means the bridge has one or more components that require attention, that its load-bearing capacity may be reduced, and that it should be monitored and prioritized for repair. 42,000 bridges. If you drove across 3 bridges today, statistically, one of them appeared on a list somewhere, a list that was filed. The average age of a bridge in the United States is 44 years. The original design life of most bridges built in the mid-20th century was 50 years. The mathematical conclusion is straightforward. The majority of American bridges are approaching or have exceeded their intended lifespan. This is not secret. This is not classified. The American Society of Civil Engineers publishes this data every 4 years. Journalists cover it. Congresspeople cite it. The reports use the word investment. They mean money. They describe a backlog of deferred maintenance estimated at $125 billion. Deferred. The same word TEPCO used. The same word the Board of Trade used when the advisory committee did not convene for 16 years. Deferred does not mean cancelled. It means move to a future that keeps receding. The I-35W Mississippi River Bridge in Minneapolis collapsed on August 1, 2007. It was rush hour. The bridge was carrying 111 vehicles. 13 people were lost. 145 were injured. The bridge was 40 years old. It had been classified as structurally deficient since 1990. 17 years. Annual inspections noted gusset plates that were undersized relative to the loads they carried. The plates had been undersized since the original 1964 design. The error was embedded in the bridge's DNA. It was born compromised. In 2001, the University of Minnesota conducted a study recommending that certain gusset plates be reinforced. The study was noted. A repair project was planned. It was deferred. On the day of the collapse, construction crews were working on the bridge deck. They had stockpiled materials on the bridge surface. 460,000 pounds of sand, gravel and equipment, concentrated near the portion of the bridge that was already weakest. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation took 18 months. The conclusion: the gusset plates were undersized by half. They had been undersized since 1964. They had been carrying loads beyond their capacity for 43 years. The additional weight of the construction materials on the day of collapse was the final variable. The bridge did not fail suddenly. It had been failing for decades. August 1st, 2007 was simply the day the mathematics concluded. Carl Eriksson was a civil engineer who had inspected the bridge multiple times. His reports, filed with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, noted deterioration. They noted the structural deficiency classification. They recommended monitoring. The monitoring continued. The bridge fell anyway. Blackwell notes the rhythm. The engineer files the report. The report is received. The report recommends action. The action is deferred. The thing falls down. A commission investigates. The report is found. The engineer is asked why he did not do more. The engineer says he filed the report. It is a closed loop, and it repeats. In Genoa, Italy, in August of 2018, the Morandi Bridge collapsed. 43 lives were lost. The bridge had been the subject of engineering concern since the 1970s. In 2017, a professor of structural engineering named Antonio Brencic publicly described the bridge as an engineering failure and called for its replacement. He was criticized for causing alarm. 11 months later, 200 meters of the bridge fell into the Polcevera Valley in 5 seconds. The investigation found that corrosion in the stay cables had been documented for decades. Maintenance contracts had been awarded and executed, but the scope of repair was consistently narrower than the scope of deterioration. The bridge was degrading faster than it was being fixed. 59 people were charged in the aftermath. The trial is the largest infrastructure prosecution in Italian history. Autostrade per l'Italia, the company that managed the bridge, had collected tolls on it for decades. The tolls generated revenue. The revenue funded dividends. The dividends went to shareholders. The maintenance budget was a percentage of revenue. The percentage was insufficient. The gap between revenue extracted and maintenance invested accumulated. It accumulated in the form of corroded steel. It accumulated for 40 years. On August 14, 2018, the accumulation became visible. This is the point where Blackwell pauses, because the pattern is no longer historical, it is not even modern, it is permanent. The memos exist right now, in filing cabinets in transportation departments across the world, on servers at utility companies, in folders marked Review by Fiscal Year End. Engineers have written them. Managers have received them. The recommendations are specific. The costs are calculated. The deferral is expected. The language has evolved. Board of Trade officials in 1910 said the regulations were adequate. TEPCO in 2008 said further study was needed. The Minnesota Department of Transportation said the bridge was on the priority list. Autostrade per l'Italia said the maintenance program was ongoing. Different words, different decades, different countries. Same sentence underneath. The fix costs money we would rather spend elsewhere. Blackwell has read the counter-argument. He has heard it many times. The counter-argument is this: resources are finite. Not every risk can be mitigated. Prioritization is not negligence. Some structures must be monitored rather than replaced. Some seawalls cannot be raised to meet every conceivable scenario. Engineering is the art of managing risk, not eliminating it. This is true, and it is precisely the logic that appears in every pre-disaster file Blackwell has ever reviewed. It is the logic of the possible deployed against the reality of the inevitable. It is correct right up until the moment it is catastrophically wrong. And the signature at the bottom of the memo is always someone who will have retired by the time the bridge falls. The retirement is not coincidental. The deferral timeline and the career timeline are calibrated to the same clock. A bridge with a remaining useful life of 15 years is someone else's problem in 15 years. A seawall that might face a once-in-a-thousand-year event is, by definition, unlikely to be tested during any single administration. The risk is long. The tenure is short. The budget is annual. The disaster is eventual. This is not cynicism. This is the documented incentive structure of every organization that manages long-lived physical infrastructure. The people who build the bridge are not the people who maintain it. The people who maintain it are not the people who fund the maintenance. The people who fund the maintenance answer to people whose planning horizon is 3 to 5 years. The bridge's lifespan is 50, and so the reports accumulate, and the maintenance is deferred, and the word adequate appears in correspondence, and then the bridge falls, or the wave overtops the wall, or the ship sinks, and a commission is convened, and the reports are found, and the word preventable appears in headlines, and new regulations are written, and the regulations are implemented, and time passes, and the regulations are revisited, and someone notes that compliance is expensive, and the word disproportionate appears in a new memo, and the cycle begins again. Blackwell has counted. Between the Titanic in 1912 and the Morandi Bridge in 2018, there have been at least 47 major infrastructure disasters in the industrialized world, where post-incident investigation found prior warnings that were documented, specific, actionable, and ignored. 47 in 106 years. 1 every 2.25 years. On average. The interval is not shrinking. Some of these are well known. The Banqiao Dam in China, 1975. The engineers knew the spillway capacity was insufficient. The dam failed during Typhoon Nina. The flood that followed affected 11 million people. The Hyatt Regency walkway collapse in Kansas City, 1981. A design change during construction altered the load path of the suspended walkways. The change was made for ease of fabrication. It doubled the load on the critical connection. 114 people died when the walkways fell during a crowded dance event. The original design had been altered without a formal engineering review. The Sampung department store in Seoul, 1995. Cracks appeared in the ceiling of the 5th floor on the morning of June 29th. The building's owner, Lee Jun, was informed. Employees were told to continue working. Shoppers were not evacuated. The building collapsed at 5:57 that evening. 502 people were lost. The cracks had been documented. The owner had been warned. He left the building before the collapse. Each of these follows the same 5 stages. Each has a memo. Each has a name attached to the warning. Each has a different name attached to the decision to defer. Blackwell wants to be precise about what this means. It does not mean that every bridge is about to collapse. It does not mean that every nuclear plant is Fukushima. It does not mean that the world is falling apart. What it means is simpler, and in some ways worse. It means the system that produces warnings works. Engineers are good at identifying risk. Seismologists are good at modeling earthquakes. Structural analysts are good at measuring corrosion. The diagnostic side of infrastructure management is functional, professional, and well documented. It is the response side that fails. Predictably, repeatedly, for the same reason, every time. The cost of prevention is immediate, visible, and attributable. A budget line can be traced to a specific decision-maker. If the money is spent and the disaster does not occur, the decision-maker receives no credit for the disaster that did not happen. They receive criticism for the money that was spent. Prevention is invisible when it works. It is only visible when it fails, at which point it is no longer prevention. It is blame. The cost of the disaster is deferred, diffuse, and often attributed to fate, nature, or unprecedented circumstances. The word unprecedented appears in post-disaster reports with striking regularity, considering how many of the events were explicitly precedented by the very warnings that were filed and ignored. This asymmetry is the engine of the cycle. It does not require malice. It does not require stupidity. It requires only a system where the people who save money today are rewarded today, and the people who pay the price pay it later. Alexander Carlyle was not incompetent. He designed the davits to hold 48 boats. His hardware was ready. His math was right. He presented the plan. He was overruled. He retired. The ship sank. He testified. He was not recalled. Yukinobu Okamura was not ignored because he was wrong. He was ignored because he was right at an inconvenient time. The Jogan earthquake of 869 was real. The modeling was accurate. The wave would come. But it would come later, and the fiscal year was ending now. Carl Eriksson filed his reports on the I-35W bridge. The reports were accurate. The gusset plates were undersized. The classification was structural deficiency. The word appeared in the annual inspection for 17 consecutive years. 17 times the same finding. 17 times the same deferral. On the 18th year, the bridge fell. Antonio Brencic called the Morandi Bridge an engineering failure in 2017. He was publicly criticized for alarmism. The bridge collapsed 11 months later. After the collapse, his assessment was cited as evidence that the danger was known. Before the collapse, his assessment was cited as evidence that academics exaggerate. The same data, the same words, the same assessment. Before the disaster, it is alarmism. After the disaster, it is evidence. Blackwell does not draw a moral from this. Morals are for fables. This is arithmetic. The arithmetic says that the cost of prevention is always known before the disaster, and the cost of the disaster is always larger than the cost of prevention, and the decision to defer prevention is always made by someone who will not personally experience the consequences of deferral. This is the structure. It was the structure in 1910. It was the structure in 2008. It is the structure now. The American Society of Civil Engineers will publish its next infrastructure report card in 2025. Blackwell does not know what grade the nation's bridges will receive. He does know the report will use the word investment. He does know the backlog will be measured in billions. He does know the word deferred will appear. And somewhere, in a filing cabinet or on a server, there is a report that has already been written about a specific bridge, or a specific dam, or a specific levee. The report identifies a specific risk. It recommends a specific action. The action has a specific cost. The report has been filed. It has been received. It has not been implemented. Blackwell cannot tell you which one it is. He can tell you the structure. Engineer identifies risk. Manager reviews cost. Cost is deemed disproportionate. Maintenance is deferred. Time passes. And then, at some point, time stops passing, and a commission is formed, and the report is found, and the word preventable appears in the findings. The memos are still being sent. The signatures are still being ignored. The warnings were ignored. Bridges, seawalls, buildings, ships. The pattern has not changed in a century. But next time, Blackwell looks at something smaller. Not a bridge, not a dam, not a ship. A pipe fitting. 1/8 of an inch. That was the difference between a standard pipe thread in Baltimore and a standard pipe thread in Washington, D.C., and it was the difference between a city that burned and a city that watched. Next, the 1/8 of an inch that burned Baltimore. Blackwell recognizes that the instinct at this point is to assume the pattern is limited to large-scale infrastructure. Bridges, nuclear plants, ocean liners, structures that cost billions and employ thousands. It would be convenient if the 5-stage pattern only operated at that scale. Convenient, but inaccurate. The pattern scales down. It scales down to a single building, a single room, a single piece of hardware that someone looked at and decided was good enough. The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top 3 floors of the Ash Building in Lower Manhattan. On March 25, 1911, 146 garment workers died in a fire that lasted approximately 18 minutes. Most of them were young women. Most of them were immigrants. The youngest was 14. The building was not a fire trap by accident. It was a fire trap by design. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, locked the doors during working hours to prevent unauthorized breaks. The single fire escape was narrow, rusted, and collapsed under the weight of the first workers who tried to use it. The elevator held 12 people. There were 600 workers on 3 floors. The owners had been warned. New York City fire inspectors had visited the building. They noted the locked doors. They noted the absence of adequate fire escapes. They issued citations. The citations carried fines of $20. $20 per violation. The owners paid the fines. They did not unlock the doors. The fines were cheaper than the lost productivity of unauthorized breaks. After the fire, Blank and Harris were charged with manslaughter. They were acquitted. Their defense argued that they did not know the doors were locked at the time of the fire. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. 2 years later, Blank was arrested again for locking the doors of his new factory during working hours. He was fined $20. 146 dead. $20. Blackwell places this alongside the Titanic, which occurred 1 year later. 2 events, 2 sets of warnings, 2 sets of filed documents, 2 sets of people who calculated that safety cost more than the alternative. The only difference in scale is the number of zeros. The Triangle Fire did produce change. It produced Frances Perkins, who witnessed the fire from the street, watched women jump from the 9th floor, and spent the next 3 decades reforming American labor law. She became the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor under Franklin Roosevelt. The New Deal's labor protections, workplace safety standards, the 40-hour work week, the legislative architecture of American worker protection traces a direct line to a Saturday afternoon in March 1911, when Frances Perkins stood on Washington Place and watched 146 people burn because the doors were locked and the fine was $20. But Frances Perkins is the exception. She is what happens when someone who witnesses the pattern decides to break it. Most witnesses do not become secretaries of labor. Most witnesses file reports. Blackwell returns to the present. In 2023, the Federal Highway Administration published updated data on the condition of American bridges. The number classified as structurally deficient had decreased slightly from the previous assessment. This was presented as progress. In absolute terms, 36,000 bridges remained on the list. 36,000 structures that carry traffic daily and have documented deficiencies that require attention. The word attention in this context means money. The estimated cost of addressing the backlog is revised upward in each assessment cycle. The funding allocated is revised upward as well, but more slowly. The gap persists. It persists the way corrosion persists in a stay cable, gradually, predictably, with the same outcome given enough time. In East Palestine, Ohio, on February 3, 2023, a Norfolk Southern freight train carrying hazardous materials derailed. The derailment resulted in a fire and the release of vinyl chloride, butyl acrylate, and other toxic chemicals. A controlled burn was ordered. A plume of black smoke rose over the town. Residents were evacuated. Some returned to find dead fish in the creeks and a chemical smell in the air and the water. The National Transportation Safety Board investigation found that a wheel bearing on one of the rail cars had been overheating for miles before the derailment. Trackside detection systems, called hot bearing detectors, recorded rising temperatures at multiple points along the route. The temperature readings exceeded the threshold for a critical alarm. The alarm triggered a warning. The crew was notified. By the time the train stopped, it was too late. 38 cars had derailed. 11 of them carried hazardous materials. The investigation also found that Norfolk Southern had lobbied against proposed federal regulations that would have required enhanced braking systems on trains carrying hazardous materials. The regulations were withdrawn in 2017. The argument was that the cost of compliance was disproportionate to the risk. Disproportionate. The same word, the same calculation, the same result. Norfolk Southern's net income in 2022 was $3.27 billion. The estimated cost of the East Palestine cleanup exceeded $1 billion. The cost of the braking regulations that were withdrawn would have been a fraction of that. The mathematics, again, were not ambiguous. They were simply calculated by people whose time horizon did not extend to February 3, 2023. Blackwell lays out the documents side by side. Not metaphorically. He describes them as if they are physical objects on a table, because in most cases they are. The White Star Line Memo on Lifeboat Allocation, 1910. TEPCO's Internal Tsunami Study, 2000. The University of Minnesota Gusset Plate Analysis, 2001. Brentsich's Public Assessment of the Morandi Bridge, 2017. The Norfolk Southern Hot Bearing Detector Readings, February 2023. The New York City Fire Inspector's Citation for Locked Doors at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, pre-1911. Different paper, different ink, different languages. Different centuries. The same sentence underneath every one of them. This will fail, and here is how, and here is what it will cost to prevent it, and here is what it will cost if you do not. Every time, the first number was smaller. Every time, the second number was chosen. Blackwell does not end with a call to action. He does not tell the viewer to write their congressman or sign a petition or inspect their local bridge. That is not what this channel does. What this channel does is show the documents, the pattern, the arithmetic, the names on the memos, the names on the deferrals, the interval between warning and collapse, the vocabulary that repeats across centuries and continents like a liturgy that no one admits to reciting. Adequate, disproportionate, further study, hypothetical, on the priority list, under review. These are the words that appear before the disaster. After the disaster, the words change. Preventable, known risk, ignored warnings, systemic failure. Different words, same file, same cabinet, same dust. The memos are still being sent, right now, today. An engineer somewhere is finishing a report. The report identifies a specific structure. The structure has a specific deficiency. The deficiency has a specific cost to repair. The engineer signs the report. The report is submitted. The report enters a system where it will be read by someone whose budget is allocated annually and whose career is measured in quarters. The engineer's name is on the report. The name of the person who defers the recommendation will not appear in any public document until after the structure fails. Then both names will appear. The engineer's name will appear in the section labeled Warnings. The other name will appear in the section labeled Accountability. But that section is always written after, never before. Blackwell has one more observation. It is not about bridges or seawalls or ships or factories. It is about time. The interval between warning and disaster varies. For the Titanic, it was 2 years. For Fukushima, it was 11 years from the 2000 study, 3 years from Okamura's 2009 presentation. For the I-35W bridge, it was 17 years from the structural deficiency classification. For the Morandi Bridge, it was decades. For the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, it was the duration between a $20 fine and a Saturday afternoon. The interval is the most dangerous variable, because during the interval, the warning is technically alive. It exists, it is filed, it is known, but it is not acted upon. And every day that passes without the disaster occurring is interpreted, consciously or not, as evidence that the warning was overstated. This is the quiet engine of the cycle. Not malice, not ignorance. Time. The slow, corrosive effect of time on urgency. The way a filed report loses its force with each quarter that passes without incident. The way adequate becomes the default assessment of any system that has not yet failed. Regardless of what the engineering says about when it will. The dam holds. The bridge carries traffic. The seawall stands. The reactor runs. The train arrives. Every day the filed report becomes slightly less urgent. Every day the deferral becomes slightly more justified. Every day the gap between the engineer's assessment and the manager's budget grows slightly wider. Until it does not. Until the day when the gap closes in 5 seconds, or in a wave, or in a fire, or in a derailment, and everything that was hypothetical becomes material, and everything that was deferred becomes due, and the commission convenes, and the documents are found, and someone says the word preventable into a microphone, and the cycle begins again. The memos are still being sent. The signatures are still being ignored. Next time, Blackwell examines something most people would never consider dangerous. A measurement. 1/8 of an inch. That was the difference between a standard pipe thread in Baltimore and a standard pipe thread in the neighboring jurisdictions. When a fire broke out in February 1904, fire companies arrived from Washington, Philadelphia, New York, Wilmington, and a dozen other cities. They connected their hoses to Baltimore's hydrants. The couplings did not fit. The threads were different. By 1/8 of an inch. The fire burned for 30 hours. It consumed 70 blocks of the city center, 1,500 buildings, 2,000 businesses. 1/8 of an inch. Next, the 1/8 of an inch that burned Baltimore.